Welcome back to Module 4, Modernizing Ohio. Our last lecture focused on the role of automation, or more generally technological innovation, in reducing the number of working class factory jobs in Ohio. Too often the images of Rustbelt Ohio, those shuttered factories, those dilapidated and abandoned homes, the long unemployment lines, those images tell an inaccurate story of Ohio. It says that Ohioans couldn't compete with the best, that they couldn't innovate fast enough and adapt with changing times. Ohio, it seems, was content with the status quo, refusing to change even as a once dynamic economy stagnated and then rusted. Where and why did those silly Ohioans go wrong? The previous lecture suggested that story was wrong. Today's lecture explores why that matters. We'll explore why that matters by discussing the term deindustrialization. When someone describes Ohio as part of the Rust Belt, they mean specifically that Ohio is part of a region that has undergone deindustrialization. The word means, at its most basic level, a decline in manufacturing jobs. And that sounds neutral, perhaps, a scientific word that describes a perfectly natural and inevitable economic process. But it's not. So let's start with the origins of the term. Deindustrialization was first used in Nazi Germany during World War II. The Nazis used the term to describe how they would treat countries they had invaded and conquered. They stripped occupied territories of their industry, in part to make the occupied territory depend on German manufacturing, and in part to punish the occupied people, to illustrate, in other words, the power the Nazis had over them. But then the Allies, the US and its friends, the victors in World War II, picked up the term from the Nazis and used it to describe how Germany might be punished after World War II. So regardless of who used the term, the word deindustrialization was invented during World War II to describe how victors stripped a vanquished nation of its industrial power. As a result, judgmental attitudes of defeat and subjugation are contained within the word. The term itself might hide these attitudes, but they are still there, lurking, shaping how we interpret what happens when, for example, Youngstown steel mills close. Youngstown lost. After World War II, the term deindustrialization went into hibernation. Not many people used it. You can see in this Google Edgram how frequently the term was used. Note the flat line before the 1940s. And then note the spike during the 1940s. And then note relatively nothing until the 1970s, when the term began appearing regularly. The spike continued throughout the 1980s and on into the 1990s. This tells us, at the very least, when Americans became most concerned about deindustrialization. So what story does the Google Ngram tell us? Clearly something important happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. But what about the previous decades? We know from the previous lecture that during the 1950s and 1960s, Ohio's factory jobs were slowly but surely disappearing because of automation. Yet automation seemed exciting and progressive. It wasn't about subjugation and defeat. Automation wasn't deindustrialization. Automation was about stepping out of the past and into the future. But of course, automation was deindustrialization, a crucial reason, in fact, why so many workers lost jobs and so many factories closed in Ohio in the second half of the 20th century. My point is that deindustrialization isn't really a scientific word that precisely and universally describes why a factory closes. Deindustrialization, depending on how you explain the term, works as a parable. And a parable is a simple story used to teach a lesson. In the Christian faith, for example, Jesus teaches through parables. And a parable teaches us how one should behave. So what does that have to do with deindustrialization? Well, let's walk through an example first, and then we'll use that example to help answer that question. Our example will compare Akron, the once thriving global center of the rubber industry turned deindustrialized nightmare, to Silicon Valley, a region in Northern California, which by the late 20th and early 21st centuries had become the source of all that is sacred to modern consumers. Technological innovation that promises to enrich your life, the personal computer, the smartphone, tablets, apps that offer endless and mindless entertainment so that you'll never be bored waiting in line to buy something. Actually, the technology keeps you from waiting in line as well. Silicon Valley has captured the attention of the world. People everywhere drive themselves, perfect their skills, spend countless thousands of dollars to get to Silicon Valley. They hope to work for Google or Apple or perhaps a hot new startup. Or maybe they want to own their own startup. People don't do that in order to get to Cleveland. They used to. Witness John D. Rockefeller. Silicon Valley has great weather, cutting edge research, very often geared towards fun stuff, and they have millionaires and billionaires seemingly on every street corner. By the way, Cleveland too once had a street called Millionaires Row. It was called Euclid Avenue, and it was home to several of the nation's most prominent industrialists. But Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg belong to Silicon Valley, and they belong to the future. So clearly, we are told, Silicon Valley is for winners. And here's what Akron seems to offer the world. An abandoned rubber factory. And what you don't see in this photo actually is more important than what you see. You don't see the abandoned, dilapidated homes that unemployed workers were kicked out of when they couldn't pay their mortgages. You don't see the crumbling schools that a dwindling tax base couldn't maintain. You don't see broken families torn apart by the loss of jobs that paid a living wage. So how could Akron compete with Silicon Valley? If Silicon Valley is the winner, then Akron must be the loser. And if we're thinking about a parable then, what's our lesson? Clearly, behave like Silicon Valley. They won, so imitate the winner. Which seems to mean basically get as many young, educated, driven people together, put them in a garage, and voila, innovation and wealth. And Akron lost, so forget about them. Akron had powerful unions that protected the workers. Fine, get rid of unions because they clearly were greedy and stood in the way of innovation. In this case, deindustrialization is a parable to teach us about the bad things, in this case the shuttered factory, that happen when you build a community the way Akron had built theirs by the 1950s. In that version of the parable, you can hear the judgment, the attitude, the evaluation inherent in the word deindustrialization. It was, from its very first invention, a word about subjugation and defeat. Silicon Valley, because it had captured the world's attention, because it had seemed to capture the future, had defeated Akron. But how accurate is that version of the parable? Let's consider a few statements about Silicon Valley. First, until the 1980s, Silicon Valley was an industrial landscape, as invested in manufacturing and working-class jobs as was Akron. Second, as a result, Silicon Valley produced both knowledge and goods. And third, from 1964 to 1984, Santa Clara County, the main county in the Silicon Valley region, added 203,000 manufacturing jobs. And one of those working class positions belonged to Paul Jobs, the adoptive father of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple and one of the definers of Silicon Valley as a high-tech, futuristic wonderland. But the way Silicon Valley went about creating factories tells us quite a bit. In 1951, the same year Ford built the revolutionary futuristic plant in Brook Park near Cleveland, Stanford University created the Stanford Industrial Park. This was simply an organization designed to develop land near the campus, very much like the university organization that redeveloped the land around the South Campus and built the Campus Gateway Project. You know the one. It was a social engineering project designed to get rid of dive bars and replace it with respectable entertainments. But the Stanford group wanted to attract industrial firms in order to capitalize on the sophisticated scientific research being done at the university. And Stanford demanded that these new factories look a certain way. They insisted that all the industrial apparatus, the smokestacks, the clock towers, the heating and cooling units, the red brick buildings, be hidden. Everything that could possibly pollute, everything that could possibly look like a factory should be buried. And the building itself should look like an office building, not a factory. They demanded, in other words, that these factories look like places that housed scholars, not laborers. So here's a photo of one of the earliest factories in the Stanford Industrial Park. It made microchips, the wonderful tiny invention that powers computers. Now this is a factory. It houses workers, not scholars. Yet it has no smokestacks. It has no clock tower announcing to the community when it was time to report to work and when it was time to eat lunch and it was time to go home. In fact, it looks like an office with lots of men and women dressed in business attire, sitting behind desks, reading reports, analyzing numbers, talking on the telephone. But inside, it's a factory very much like the Cincinnati slaughterhouses. Workers wearing overalls, standing on the assembly line hour after hour, repeating the same task over and over. To Stanford, in 1951, this was the future. Yet it looked nothing like the way Ohioans defined the future in 1951. Now remember, this to Ohioans was the future in 1951. Now, it's not as if Silicon Valley had figured something out, had been more clever than Ohio. Yes, they hid their smokestacks, but that just meant burying everything that could possibly smell, look, or taste like pollution. So did this get rid of the pollution? Well, no, of course not. What you see is a map of Superfund sites in Santa Clara County. A Superfund site is a designation by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that singles out places that suffer from especially toxic industrial waste. And Santa Clara County, the site of Silicon Valley, has more Superfund sites than any other county in the nation. So Silicon Valley at its core was an industrial site, as industrial, as polluting, as working class as any urban industrial setting in Ohio. As industrial as Akron, for example. And Akron, for its part today, is as involved in the production of sophisticated knowledge as is Silicon Valley. Akron's specialty stems from its past experience with the rubber industry. It focuses today on polymer chemical research. It's all very high-tech and quite beyond my comprehension, but polymer chemicals play a major role in the building of such things as modern automobiles, in innovating new building supplies, in creating new marine and aeronautical equipment, and even in biomedical research like replacement hearts. It's just that we don't experience polymer chemical research the same way we experience Silicon Valley research. We don't play with it. We don't surf the web with it. It doesn't entertain us. Though Akron's research just might save our lives. So when we put Akron and Silicon Valley side by side, here's what we get. In both places in 1980, manufacturing employment provided 35% of total jobs. But after 1980, both places jettisoned manufacturing jobs. That is, they deindustrialized. And instead, both places invested in the high-value intellectual research and development part of the business. But only Akron is considered to be part of the Rust Belt, to have been a loser in the game of capitalism. But why? What's the source of Silicon Valley's genius? It's not as if Silicon Valley business people are any better capitalists than Ohioans. Their genius stems from a decision, a political decision, made during World War II and continued throughout the Cold War. The federal government spent countless billions on research in Silicon Valley, military research in particular. So without government intervention, Silicon Valley could never have been created. So why are they the capitalist victors and Akron the losers? Let's revisit the photo from the first minute of the lecture. This is taken in Akron, Ohio. In fact, it's Goodyear's Innovation Center, where they do high-tech research. It used to be plant number 2 in Goodyear's tire-making empire. Unlike the Stanford Industrial Park, this building was built to look like a factory, and smell like a factory, and pollute like a factory. And you can still see the clock tower that used to announce to all when work started, when the lunch break happened, and when the shift changed. Today, though it looks like a factory, it's a high-end research lab. So the main difference between Silicon Valley and Akron seems to be that Silicon Valley built factories to look like office buildings, and Akron built office buildings that look like factories. So why does Silicon Valley get all the good press? Another way to say it is this. Why did this image capture the definition of the future and not this image? After all, this factory still works. The other one closed down years ago. Yes, this factory used to employ over 15,000 workers and now employs only about 1,500, but that's automation. And this factory, more than the microchip company, told us in 1951 where American manufacturing was headed in the future. So we should finish by returning to the parable. You can learn different lessons from deindustrialization if you start with different images in your mind. If you start with the Brook Park Ford plant, automation or technological progress is the main cause of deindustrialization. And moreover, Ohio seems not so pathetic, so stuck in the past, reliving its glory years. In this version of the parable, Ohio in 1951 was the future. If you start your parable with this image of a factory in Silicon Valley circa 1955, then you'll end up learning a different lesson. Silicon Valley's mythology, though not true, was widely accepted as truth. No unions to get in the way of innovation, no government regulation to harass entrepreneurs, just a bunch of highly skilled, ambitious risk takers who, in the garages, invented the future. Now, Steve Jobs summarized the main lesson of this parable in a dinner meeting he had with President Barack Obama. Jobs, befitting his stature, sat next to the president. Or maybe Obama, befitting his stature, sat next to Jobs. Either way, Jobs told Obama that the U.S. needed to be more like China. He meant that business regulations and labor rules stalled innovation. Jobs wanted, in other words, to return to an America circa 1900, one without significant regulations that guided how corporations treated workers and was free to pollute at will. He wanted a federal government that was an assistant to a large corporation rather than a master. He wanted a return to the days of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. The key here in this image is that deindustrialization didn't happen in Silicon Valley, even though we know it did. Why not? Not many people realize how industrial Silicon Valley actually was, how much like Akron it really was. That's purposeful. They hid their working class industrial origins because deindustrialization happens to losers, not winners. And so if you begin your parable with this image of an abandoned rubber factory in Akron, Ohio, then you might immediately think one of two things. One, sure, that's what happens when you get stuck in the past, when you fail to change. It's Akron's own fault that this happened. They got what they deserved. Or two, maybe you see in this image despair and betrayal felt by workers as their mines, their factories, their mills were padlocked and abandoned, or perhaps renovated and turned into high-tech research labs that would pay them only a meager wage to sweep the floors. Maybe you think to yourself, this image communicates how these abandoned workers felt when the factory closed, like an occupying force had destroyed their way of life, driving them not only from their workplaces, but often their homes and communities as well. Which parable you believe shapes how you respond, with a shrug of the shoulders and a casual, well, you can't stop the future, or maybe with a cold statement that gets to the bottom line quickly. Efficiency and profit are paramount. Human dignity matters less. Or maybe for you, any discussion of deindustrialization starts and ends with its effect on human dignity. So which parable makes sense to you?